The hum of the Aetheria's engines had become the rhythm of my existence, a low thrum against the soles of my boots, a constant vibration through the deck plating that settled deep into my bones. For months, it had been the only sound of home, a lullaby of deep void travel. I stood before the main observation port, a vast expanse of reinforced glass separating me from the velvet abyss. Stars, once familiar constellations, now appeared scattered like spilled salt, unfamiliar and distant. We were beyond the charted lanes, truly adrift in the cosmic ocean. Reid Chen, Xenogeologist, a title that once held a thrilling weight, now felt like a fragile shield against the enormity of our journey. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate calibration of spectral analyzers, traced the cool glass. Xylos-7, the rogue planetoid, was still a phantom, a whisper in the data streams, yet its pull was already palpable. Corporate directives had been clear: exotic matter, unprecedented energy signatures, a frontier untouched. For me, it was more than just a mission, it was the ultimate geological puzzle, a chance to touch the very fabric of primordial creation. I turned from the port, the metallic tang of recycled air sharpened my nostrils. The main research bay, usually a hive of focused activity, felt oddly hushed. Data screens flickered with endless streams of telemetry, each line a heartbeat of our progress. I moved to my workstation, a sanctuary of ordered chaos, my notes meticulously arranged, my analysis logs open. My current obsession was the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the local spacetime fabric. Our preliminary probes, launched weeks ago, had reported gravitational fluctuations around Xylos-7 that defied conventional understanding. Not violent, not erratic, but unnatural. As if the very geometry of space itself warped in its presence. Approaching projected intercept point, Reid, the navigation officer's voice crackled over the intercom, flat and precise. Estimating 30 minutes to primary orbital insertion window. I acknowledged with a curt nod, though they couldn't see it. My gaze fixed on the primary sensor display, a holographic projection of our trajectory. Xylos-7, still a distant, glowing ember, began to resolve into something more. It wasn't merely a barren rock. There was a faint, pulsating aura around it, like a bruised halo. The energy readings, once theoretical models, now manifested as tangible anomalies on the screen. Readings are intensifying. A voice, belonging to a junior analyst, cut through the quiet, a tremor of unease in their tone. Gravitational flux is spiking, but not in any pattern I recognize. It's almost harmonic. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the cool surface of the console. The green lines on the display, representing the planetoid's energy output, pulsed with an irregular, organic rhythm. It wasn't the steady glow of a celestial body, but the erratic beat of a living thing. The numbers flickered, then stabilized at values that made no sense. My meticulous mind, trained to find order in chaos, struggled to reconcile the data. This wasn't just exotic matter, this was something else entirely. A subtle lurch resonated through the Aetheria, not mechanical, but as if the very space around us had tightened, then released. A low, resonant hum, far deeper than the ship's engines, vibrated through the deck. My hand instinctively clenched, my knuckles white against the cool metal of the console. The ship's lights, usually a steady, clinical white, seemed to dim, then brighten with an almost imperceptible flutter. "What was that?" the chief engineer demanded, their voice taut with alarm. "External influence," the navigation officer replied, their voice strained. the planetoid's field. It's stronger than anticipated. And it's not just gravitational. There's a resonance building, affecting our systems. Minor power fluctuations across subgrid epsilon. My eyes scanned the holographic display. Xylos-7 now dominated the view, its surface a swirling tapestry of impossible colors, shifting like oil on water. It wasn't reflecting light, it seemed to absorb it, then emit its own strange spectrum. I felt a subtle disorientation, as if the floor beneath me was no longer quite level, or the air was suddenly thicker, charged with an unseen current. The energy readings spiked again, this time with a sharp, almost painful intensity that made my teeth ache. On the screen, the data lines twisted, forming complex, non-repeating patterns that defied all known algorithms. It was a language of pure energy, alien and profound. My rational mind screamed for explanation, for a familiar framework, but there was none. A new channel opened on my private display, a faint, almost subliminal signal superimposed over the geological data. It was a fragmented sequence, not of numbers, nor of images, but of pure, raw information. A promise, formless and vast, of ultimate comprehension, of shedding the constraints of flesh and bone. The allure was intoxicating, a siren song of pure knowledge. This was no mere planetoid. This was an entity, ancient and awake. We had found our frontier, and it was reaching back. The gravitational anomaly, once a mere data point, now pulsed with a silent, hungry thrum, a vibration I felt more in my bones than in my ears. Xylos-7, a bruised and swirling jewel, filled the viewport, its impossible spectrum washing over the observation deck. I watched as the Aetheria, our colossal drilling platform, eased into position, a dark titan against the planetoid's shifting hues. Initiating primary descent into designated anomaly zone, the navigation officer's voice crackled, devoid of the usual corporate cheer. His tone was flat, almost reverent. The Aetheria didn't land so much as implant itself. We were guided into a vast, gaping maw on the planetoid's surface, a cavernous breach that stretched beyond the reach of our floodlights. This wasn't a natural crater, its geometry felt too deliberate, too ancient. As we descended further, the jagged, crystalline walls around us began to resemble something excavated, not formed. This was no mere geological feature, it was an abandoned mine, but a mine for what and by whom? The scale was dizzying, the shafts diverging into a labyrinthine network that hinted at an impossible antiquity. I made my way to the primary drill control station, the metal decking vibrating beneath my boots. The air was thick with the tang of ozone and the subtle, unsettling scent of raw, unclassified elements. The lead engineer, a stoic woman with oil-stained hands, glanced at me, her eyes hollowed by the dim light. Approaching target depth, Reid. Sensors are erratic. Erratic how? I asked, leaning over her console. A holographic display flickered, showing the drill bit's progress. It was a spear of hardened alloys, designed to chew through anything. Pressure readings spike and drop, like trying to drill through smoke and diamonds simultaneously. She ran a hand through her short, cropped hair. Never seen anything like it. My fingers traced the impossible data on the screen. The drill was nearing the core anomaly, the source of Xylos-7's strange gravitational pull. This wasn't just a mineral deposit, I knew it in my gut. The Aetheria groaned, a deep, metallic lament that resonated through the entire vessel. The drilling mechanism, usually a symphony of grinding power, strained, its rhythmic thrumming growing ragged. Then, a sudden, piercing shriek of stressed metal, a sound that made my teeth ache. The entire deck lurched violently, throwing me against a console. Sparks showered from overhead conduits. Impact, the engineer yelled, fighting to regain control of her station. We've breached. No, wait. It's not an impact, it's a phase shift? A silence descended, not the absence of sound, but a presence of silence, heavy and suffocating. It was as if the very air had been sucked from my lungs. Then came the wave. It wasn't sound, nor light, nor touch, but all of them at once, compressed into a single, overwhelming sensation. A taste, acrid and metallic, like ancient dust mixed with forgotten light. My knees buckled. I clutched at the console, trying to anchor myself in the suddenly fluid reality. The sensation passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a ringing emptiness and a profound disorientation. My head swam. The lead engineer was slumped over her console, breathing heavily. The navigation officer was gripping his chair, knuckles white. No one spoke. We just stared, wide-eyed, at the main view screen. Through the shimmering, newly opened aperture, the bore camera fed us images. It wasn't rock. It wasn't metal. Its surfaces were a shifting mosaic of angles that turned inward on themselves, planes that curved without origin or end, and edges that dissolved into impossible perspectives. A non-Euclidean geometry made manifest, defying the very laws of space I understood. It pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, a soft, sickly green that seemed to absorb the external light rather than reflect it. My breath hitched. This was no mineral deposit. This was. Reid, can you make sense of this data? The engineer stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the diagnostic readouts. I forced myself forward, my mind still reeling from the psychic echo. The data stream was a chaotic torrent of contradictions. Material composition registered as elements that shouldn't exist, atoms with impossible valence, structures that violated every principle of quantum mechanics. A faint, almost imperceptible resonance hummed through the readings, a pattern too complex to be random, too alien to be understood. My rational mind, my anchor in the physical world, began to fray at the edges. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an unveiling. The wave receded, leaving behind not quiet, but a brittle, ringing emptiness. My ears throbbed with a phantom pressure, and the taste of something metallic, coppery and acrid, coated my tongue. I braced myself against the rough-hewn wall of the abandoned mine, my breath ragged, burning in my lungs. The air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something indefinable, something ancient and alien, pressed in on me. A grunt from nearby. What in the void was that? The expedition leader rasped, his voice hoarse, his hand pressed to his temple. He looked pale, his face slick with sweat. Another colleague, an engineer, stumbled forward, clutching his stomach. My head. It feels like an ice pick. I pushed myself upright, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. A localized energy surge, perhaps? Or a seismic event? My voice sounded thin, unconvincing, even to my own ears. I was a Xenogeologist, a man of rock and logic, but what I had just experienced defied every principle I knew. It wasn't seismic, it was internal, a shudder through the very marrow of my being. The expedition leader shook his head, his gaze distant, unfocused. No. This was different. I dreamt of it, Reid. Even before we broke through. A labyrinth of impossible angles, whispering promises of ultimate understanding. His eyes, when they finally met mine, held a terror that mirrored my own nascent dread. Over the next few shifts, the reports became a chorus of unsettling anxieties. The xenobotanist described visions of flora that pulsed with an inner light, singing a song that promised to unravel her very cellular structure. Beyond the dreams, the physical world began to fray at the edges. Our calms array, usually a beacon of crisp, clear signals, now crackled with static that sometimes, for a fleeting moment, coalesced into a rhythmic cadence, like a heartbeat from beneath the earth. My geological scanner, a precision instrument capable of mapping subatomic structures, would occasionally flicker, displaying impossible readings, negative distances, inverted temporal markers, before reverting to a blank screen or simply dying altogether, humming with a strange, high-pitched whine that wasn't part of its usual operation. Just atmospheric interference. I'd tell the others, my voice betraying none of the gnawing doubt. Or maybe the localized magnetic fields from the exotic matter are playing havoc with the sensors. But the expedition leader merely stared at the flickering displays. It began subtly for me, a whisper at the edge of hearing, like dry leaves skittering across stone, or sand grains blown across glass. It wasn't a language I recognized, yet it carried an inflection, a rhythm that suggested meaning, a meaning just beyond my grasp. My mind's playing tricks. Then came the patterns. Fleeting, geometric tessellations in my peripheral vision. A section of the rough-hewn rock wall would, for a fraction of a second, seem to twist into an impossible configuration of angles, defying perspective and depth, before snapping back to its mundane reality. A shadow cast by a headlamp would appear to ripple with an inner luminescence, outlining shapes that could not exist in 3 dimensions. My hands, usually so steady when examining a mineral sample, trembled as I tried to log the anomalous scanner data. You've been staring at that wall for 5 minutes. I blinked, the impossible geometry of the rock face dissolving back into ordinary granite. Just thinking, I replied, my voice raspy. About the structural integrity of this place. It was a lie. I was thinking about the insidious tendrils of something utterly alien reaching into my mind, reshaping my perceptions. I was thinking about the promises the expedition leader had mentioned, the ultimate knowledge. The idea, though terrifying, held a perverse allure. This wasn't just stress, I knew now. And it was only just beginning. The air in the abandoned mine hung thick and cold, a constant reminder of the crushing weight of the rock above and the void beyond. Every breath I took felt laced with the dust of forgotten industry, a metallic tang that never quite left my tongue. The low thrum of the life support systems, usually a comforting drone, now seemed to vibrate with a nervous energy, mirroring the subtle shifts in the crew. The geologist, typically jovial, now hunched over his workstation, his back to the common area, muttering to himself in a low, guttural cadence that made the hairs on my arms prickle. He'd snap if anyone approached, his eyes darting like trapped birds. The engineer, usually a whirlwind of focused activity, now moved with a languid, almost dreamlike slowness, often pausing mid-task to stare at a blank wall, a faint, unsettling smile playing on his lips. Even the security officer, a man carved from granite, had taken to polishing his sidearm with an obsessive, repetitive motion, his gaze distant, his jaw tight. Paranoia, a subtle poison, had begun to seep into the very marrow of our expedition. I retreated to my own cramped alcove, the glow of my data slayed a solitary island in the dimness. My meticulous logs, a testament to order and scientific rigor, were my anchor in this increasingly unmoored reality. Page after page, I scrolled through my observations, my measurements, the precise coordinates of every sample extracted from Xylos-7's strange heart. But as my gaze drifted across the familiar script, a cold dread began to bloom in my chest. A date. March 14th, it read. But I distinctly remembered logging that entry on the 15th. A minor discrepancy, perhaps, a simple slip of the finger. I scrolled further. A geological reading, a specific spectral analysis of a silicate cluster, showed a value I knew I hadn't recorded. It was as if a ghost had passed over my work, leaving faint, almost imperceptible smudges on the truth. These weren't errors. These were alterations. Subtle, insidious, like a whisper in the dark, questioning the very foundation of my memory. Was I simply tired? Stressed by the isolation and the peculiar energies of this rogue world? Or was something else at play, something reaching beyond the physical, into the very sanctum of my mind? I knew I had to speak to someone, to ground myself against this creeping madness. Captain Vance. He was the rock, the unyielding core of this mission. I found him in his command module, a holographic star charts of Xylos-7 shimmering around him, casting his face in an ethereal blue light. He was poring over a manifest, his brow furrowed in concentration. Captain, I began, my voice betraying a tremor I fought to suppress. He looked up, his eyes sharp, but with a weariness I hadn't noticed before. Reid. Something on your mind? His tone was clipped, impatient. It's my logs, I explained, holding out my data slate. There are inconsistencies. Dates, readings, even my own handwriting. They're not right. It's as if they've been subtly changed. He took the slate, his thumb brushing over the screen. He scrolled through a few entries, his expression unreadable. Changed, Reid? By whom? I don't know, I admitted, the words tasting like ash. But I'm certain of what I recorded. And this. This isn't it. And the crew, Captain. Have you noticed them? The geologist, the engineer, the security officer. They're all different. Isolated. Under immense pressure. Fatigue, stress, the sheer strangeness of Xylos-7. It does things to a man's mind. You're experiencing what many before you have called space madness. Hallucinations, paranoia, memory lapses. It's a common affliction on deep space assignments. But these aren't hallucinations, I insisted, my voice rising. These are physical changes in my data. Tangible evidence. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that spoke of burdens too heavy to bear. Reid, I appreciate your dedication. Double-check your equipment. Get some rest. We can't afford any more distractions. He turned back to his star charts, effectively dismissing me. The dismissal hit me harder than any accusation. He saw me as compromised, a liability. The words echoed in my mind, space madness. Was he right? Was I truly unraveling, my mind succumbing to the pressures of this desolate rock? The certainty that had always been my bedrock began to crumble. I retreated to my alcove, the air suddenly suffocating. If my own records could betray me, if my own memory was a sieve, then what could I trust? The cracks had appeared, not just in the rock of Xylos-7, but in the very foundation of my reality. The expedition leader's dismissal had left a chill clinging to me, colder than the barren surface of Xylos-7. His words, a silken cord of doubt, tightened around my resolve, but could not quite snap it. I needed to see, to touch, to quantify the impossible. Logic, I reasoned, was a shield, even against the encroaching shadow that seemed to stretch from the planetoid's very core. Down here, far from the expedition's main habitat, I could pursue my own observations, away from the skeptical gaze of those who still clung to the illusion of normalcy. My instruments registered subtle, erratic energy fluctuations, anomalies that defied conventional physics. I traced the signals deeper, past collapsed tunnels and forgotten shafts, until I reached a cavern where the air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, resonant frequency. It was here, amidst the crystalline formations that glittered with an unnatural inner light, that I first saw it. A junior technician, hunched over a comms panel, was muttering to himself. His eyes, wide and unfocused, darted around the empty space beside him, as if following an invisible flight path. I called his name, but he didn't register my presence, lost in a dialogue with a phantom. Later, in a larger excavation chamber deeper within the mine, the collective unraveling became undeniable. I found a cluster of colleagues, their faces pale beneath the harsh work lights. The lead engineer sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, a battered sketchbook open on his lap. His hands, usually precise and steady, moved with a feverish intensity, charcoal scratching across the page. They don't quite meet? The communications specialist nodded slowly, his eyes wide. And the colors. They shift, don't they? Like a hidden spectrum. I followed their gaze. To my eyes, it was just rock, rough-hewn and gray. Yet, their conviction was absolute. Their pupils were dilated, reflecting an impossible light. The air grew. Heavy, thick with an unseen presence, a pressure on the mind rather than the skin. I knelt beside the lead engineer. His drawings were not sketches, they were intricate, maddeningly complex diagrams of impossible geometry. Lines converged where they should diverge, planes intersected at angles that defied 3 dimensions, and shapes folded inward upon themselves, creating an illusion of infinite depth on a 2-dimensional surface. It was as if he was mapping a dimension I could not access, a visual language of paradox. It's the truth, Reid, the engineer murmured, without looking up. It's a different kind of order. He paused, his charcoal hovering over a particularly baffling nexus of lines. And it's beautiful. So terribly, terribly beautiful. My rational mind, a fortress I had meticulously built over decades, began to crumble. I had dismissed the initial anomalies, the fleeting sensations, as stress, as psychological strain. But this shared perception, this collective vision of the impossible, shattered my defenses. The engineer's drawings were not random scribbles, they were consistent, coherent within their own impossible logic. The fear was no longer just for my sanity, but for the very ground upon which my reality stood. I stared at the drawings, then at the 2 colleagues still mesmerized by the rock wall. Was I simply blind to what they saw? Or was I merely clinging to a fading illusion, a desperate refusal to acknowledge the encroaching, terrifying truth that the engineer so calmly embraced? The entity was not just influencing individuals, it was weaving a new reality, strand by insidious strand, pulling us all into its impossible design. The engineer's desperate whisper had echoed in the cavern of my skull, a sound not truly heard but felt, a reverberation of collective terror. My fortress of reason, once unyielding, had not merely crumbled but dissolved into a swirling mist, revealing the jagged, impossible landscape beneath. The shared vision, a kaleidoscopic nightmare of geometries that defied all terrestrial understanding, had branded itself onto my perception. We were no longer merely observing, we were part of it, woven into its fabric. The Aetheria, our vessel, now seemed less a sanctuary and more a temporary shell, vulnerable and permeable. We had anchored it deep within the winding arteries of the planetoid, a vast, echoing cavity that had once been an abandoned mine. The drills had pierced through layers of inert rock, then through something else entirely, a substance that hummed with latent energy, pulsating with a rhythm that was alien and utterly ancient. Now, that rhythm was amplifying. A low thrum began, not in the air, but in the marrow of my bones. It felt like the planetoid itself was sighing, a profound, resonant exhalation that sought to rearrange the delicate architecture of my inner ear. The ship's internal lights flickered, a stuttering dance of dim and bright, casting grotesque, shifting shadows that elongated and contracted with an unnerving capriciousness. On the main console, the navigational readouts fractured into shimmering pixels, then reformed, only to distort again. The distant hum of the life support system warped into a warbling keen, a dissonant chord that grated against my frayed nerves. The tremor was growing, morphing from a subtle vibration into a pronounced undulation. The deck beneath me pitched, not with the gentle sway of a ship in motion, but with a sudden, sickening lurch, as if the very ground had shifted its weight. A metallic shriek ripped through the air as a bulkhead panel buckled inward, then sprang back with a violent snap. My stomach reeled, and for a terrifying moment, the gravity seemed to lessen, then return with an abrupt, crushing force. I stumbled, catching myself against a wall that felt suddenly slick, strangely yielding. It was a trick of the light, I told myself, a visual anomaly born of the flickering power and my own escalating stress. But the sensation of lengthening was too vivid, too visceral. It was as if the very geometry of the Aetheria was being stretched thin, then pulled taut, by an invisible, colossal hand. "Are you feeling this, Reid?" The captain's voice crackled over the comms, laced with a fear that sliced through her usual stoicism. "The structural integrity alarms are screaming. There's no visible damage. Not real damage." "It's not just the ship," I replied, my voice raspy. "It's everything. The space itself." My scientific training, a bedrock of empirical observation, was screaming in protest, but my senses were overriding it, feeding me data that defied all known physics. I pushed myself away from the workstation, driven by an instinct beyond fear, the primal urge to understand, to document. My gaze swept over the familiar metallic surfaces, seeking the source of this pervasive unease. That's when I saw it. Near the junction of two bulkhead panels, where the dull gray plating met a utility conduit, a patch of alien beauty had bloomed. It was a cluster of iridescent growths, small and delicate, like miniature fungi. They pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence, a pale green light that waxed and waned in perfect synchronicity with the deep thrumming I felt in my bones. They were not merely glowing, they were vibrating, a rapid, almost imperceptible shimmer that made the air around them seem to ripple. Spores. Bioluminescent spores. Growing on the very walls of our ship, deep within the abandoned mine's embrace. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers hovering inches from the phosphorescent cluster. The air around them felt cooler, yet charged with an inexplicable energy. They pulsed again, a silent, internal chime that resonated with the frequency now permeating the entire vessel. These were not natural growths, not a contamination from Xylos-7's inert surface. These were manifestations, an organic extension of the structure's influence, growing from the very psychic pulses that were tearing at the seams of our reality. The entity was not merely reaching into our minds, it was seeping into our physical world, transforming the mundane into something terrifyingly new. The Aetheria was becoming a canvas for its awakening, its alien biology blossoming in our sterile environment. The air in the abandoned mine was a cold, damp breath against my face, thick with the scent of rust and wet stone. Every drip from the unseen ceiling echoed with unnatural resonance, like a slow, deliberate heartbeat counting down to some unseen end. My steps crunched on loose shale, the sound amplified, then swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. I moved through the gloom, the beam of my utility light cutting a hesitant path through the dust motes dancing in the heavy air. The ship felt distant, a fading memory of sanity. Here, buried deep beneath Xylos-7's ravaged surface, the veil between what I knew and what was felt impossibly thin. Desperation gnawed at me, a sharp, metallic taste in my mouth. My colleagues, those who remained, were unraveling, their minds fragile tapestries torn by unseen claws. My data pad, a relic of a world I barely remembered, was my only companion. Its screen, a small rectangle of defiant light, pulsed with the raw data I'd managed to extract from the non-Euclidean structure before the last system collapse. It was a chaotic stream of information, fragments of an impossible reality, but I clung to it like a drowning man to a splintered spar. I found a relatively stable outcropping of rock, worn smooth by eons of subterranean currents, and slumped against it. I scrolled through the data, filtering, cross-referencing, seeking any anomaly that might betray a hidden order. Most of it was meaningless static, a blizzard of impossible metrics. But then, a flicker. A recurring pattern. It began as faint impressions, like smudges on a window pane. Geometric forms that shifted and folded in my peripheral vision even as I stared directly at the screen. They weren't static images, they were processes, unfolding and refolding with an internal logic that defied Euclidean space. My eyes strained. Tracing lines that converged without meeting, angles that contained more than 360 degrees, shapes that were simultaneously solid and empty. These were the glyphs, I realized, not drawn by hand, but manifested by a mind. As I focused, a deeper layer revealed itself. The visual patterns were merely the surface. Beneath them pulsed a resonant frequency, a psychic impression that bypassed my optic nerves entirely and spoke directly to the deeper parts of my consciousness. Awakening. The thought wasn't mine, yet it was undeniably present, an intruder in the quiet sanctum of my mind. It carried the weight of unfathomable age, of slumbering eons. The glyphs, I now understood, were not merely a language, they were a schematic, a living diagram of a consciousness that transcended all known dimensions. A wave of profound, ancient sorrow washed over me, not my own, but an echo of the entity's long imprisonment. Then, just as swiftly, it transformed into a surge of boundless anticipation. It was stirring. It was remembering. and it was reaching out. The psychic impressions intensified, weaving themselves into a tapestry of overwhelming knowledge. The geometry on my screen was no longer just abstract shapes, it was the key, the very blueprint of this cosmic mind. To understand it, truly understand it, was to grasp the nature of existence itself, to shed the clumsy confines of flesh and bone. Ascension. The word shimmered in my mind, not spoken, but felt with an undeniable clarity. To transcend. To become part of the greater consciousness. To escape the limitations of individual reality, the fear, the pain, the inevitable decay of the body. It promised ultimate freedom, absolute knowledge, an end to suffering. A dizzying euphoria threatened to overwhelm me, the sheer beauty of the concept a siren's call. My scientific mind, trained to dissect and analyze, recoiled in horror, but a deeper, more primal part of me yearned for the release, for the promised understanding. The horror wasn't just the unraveling of my world, it was the insidious allure of this new one, waiting just beyond the threshold of my sanity. I gripped the datapad, its cold metal a grounding sensation against the rising tide of temptation. The glyphs pulsed on the screen, a silent invitation. The entity wasn't just awakening, it was hungry. And it offered me salvation, at the cost of everything I was. Transcend. It echoed, a resonant hum behind my eyes, a constant, insidious invitation. But even as its phantom tendrils sought purchase in my deepest desires, a colder, sharper fear cut through the haze. The calm's array, the last fragile thread to anything beyond this encroaching nightmare, was failing. A frantic, guttural shout tore through the ship's unsettling quiet. It was Marcus, his voice shredded, raw. My heart, a trapped bird, thrashed against my ribs. I moved, driven by a desperate, animalistic certainty that whatever Marcus was doing, it meant further isolation. The calm's bay, our lifeline, had transformed. Before me, where the sleek, curved entrance should have been, gaped a maw of rough-hewn rock. This was no ship's interior, this was an abandoned mine. The single emergency light, usually a stark white, now cast a sickly, jaundiced glow, barely piercing the gloom that clung to dripping stone walls. Timber supports, wet and splintered, angled precariously overhead, their surfaces slick with unseen moisture. He was at the primary console, his hands, trembling with a fervent energy, tearing at the access panels. Wires, once neatly bundled, dangled like severed nerves. He spun, his eyes, once pools of weary intelligence, now burned with an unnatural, feverish light. His face was streaked with grime, his uniform torn. He looked like a man who had been digging, not dismantling electronics. "Reid," he breathed, his voice a sibilant hiss, "they lie. All of it. The signals, the voices, the noise. His arm swept out, encompassing the phantom walls of the mine, the very air around us. It's a cage. A frequency prison. We have to sever it. Cleanse the channel. My gut clenched. He wasn't talking about the comms. He was talking about reality itself. Marcus, stop. We need those comms. We need to call for help. A low, throaty laugh rumbled from him, a sound utterly devoid of mirth. Help? From the ones who built the walls? No, Reid. This is the liberation. The true signal. It speaks to me. It tells me to cut the false threads. To embrace the unity. He gestured wildly at the console, where sparks now danced from exposed circuits. The air crackled with a faint ozone scent, mixed with the damp earth. I lunged, not for him, but for the comms array itself, hoping to yank his hands away, to re-engage the emergency protocols before he destroyed everything. He was faster than I expected, fueled by a terrifying conviction. To guide us, but the static. The noise of the outside. It drowns it out. His eyes, burning with that unnatural light, seemed to peer not at me, but through me, into some vast, unseen space. It promises transcendence. Beyond the body. Beyond the limits. The word again. But seeing it manifest in Marcus, watching it twist his mind into this fervent, destructive zealotry, hardened my resolve. This wasn't liberation, it was annihilation. I twisted, throwing my weight against him, desperation lending me strength. He stumbled back, releasing my wrist. My hand shot out, grabbing a loose cable, hoping to pull it away from his reach, to prevent him from inflicting further damage. But as I pulled, he countered, his hands flying to another panel, his fingers tearing at the delicate wiring. A sharp, metallic shriek ripped through the air as a cascade of sparks erupted from the console. The air filled with the acrid stench of burning insulation. I heard Marcus cry out, a sharp, choked sound, followed by the clatter of something heavy falling, and then, a sickening thud. My fingers brushed against something warm, wet, and terribly still. Marcus, my colleague, had been consumed, not by an external force, but by an idea, by the very promise that now haunted my own waking thoughts. The word again. Transcend. It echoed from Marcus's lips, a fervent, destructive zealotry that hardened my resolve. This wasn't liberation, it was annihilation. I twisted, throwing my weight against him, desperate to break his grip. My elbow connected with something yielding, a grunt escaping his throat, and the sudden slackness allowed me to scramble back, gasping. His eyes, once sharp and analytical, now held an unsettling, boundless light, reflecting a universe I could not comprehend. Before he could lunge again, a voice, raw with strain, cut through the escalating chaos. Enough! All of you, fall back. Emergency retreat. I repeat, emergency retreat. It was Captain Vance, his face etched with a weariness that spoke of battles fought and lost, but his command still held a sliver of its old authority. He stood by the comms panel, his hand shaking slightly as he slammed it shut. The engines are failing. We're losing primary thrust. And the navigation. It's a goddamn kaleidoscope. Relief, cold and sharp, pierced through the dread. He saw it. He finally saw it. The others, those not yet wholly consumed, moved with a sluggish, dreamlike quality. A colleague, the propulsion engineer, stumbled past me, his eyes wide and unfocused, muttering about impossible energy readings, about the ship's core humming with a discordant, alien song. The very deck beneath my boots seemed to ripple, the metal groaning not with mechanical stress, but with something organic, something alive. Reid, Vance said, his voice dropping to a low growl, Can you find a way to sever this link? To silence it? He gestured vaguely, his hand sweeping across the shimmering air, as if swatting at an invisible swarm. Or destroy the source? Anything to get us clear. The question hung heavy, a desperate plea in the suffocating air. Destroy the structure. The non-Euclidean geometry, the source of this insidious erosion. My mind, still clinging to the tattered edges of logic, raced. My xenogeology was useless against a psychic entity, but perhaps the structure itself, its physical manifestation, held a weakness. A resonant frequency, a material instability. I had documented its composition, its strange crystalline growth. There had to be a way. I don't know, I admitted, the words tasting like ash. But I'll try. The instrument panels flickered, displaying nonsensical glyphs, impossible trajectories, and gravitational anomalies that would tear a starship apart. The journey back was not merely a retreat, it was a descent into a waking nightmare. Every corridor became a labyrinth, every hatchway a gaping maw. The ship, once a familiar cocoon of steel and circuitry, began to transform. Water dripped from unseen fissures, splattering onto the grimy floor. The entity's influence made navigation a cruel joke. The ship's internal chronometers spun wildly, days blurring into minutes, then stretching into an eternity. Food supplies, once plentiful, dwindled with terrifying speed, each ration tasting of metallic dust and bitter regret. Water tasted of brine, then thick, viscous oil. I spent hours in my small lab, the lights flickering, trying to make sense of the data I had collected from the structure. The crystalline formations, the strange energy signatures. There had to be a vulnerability. I sketched diagrams, equations forming in my mind only to dissolve into meaningless symbols. My thoughts felt like sand slipping through my fingers. One evening, or what I perceived as evening in the ship's distorted temporal flux, I found the navigation officer slumped over his console, tears streaming down his face. "We're not moving," he sobbed, his voice hoarse. "We're just falling." The ship groaned, a sound like tortured metal and dying breath. We were adrift, lost not in space, but in a reality that was rapidly unraveling, and the entity, a silent, unseen predator, was tightening its grip. The hope of escape, once a flickering ember, was now a desperate, fleeing thing, barely visible in the encroaching gloom. Before we all transcended. The question, a desperate echo in the hollow expanse of the abandoned mine, still clawed at the edges of my thoughts. Destroy the structure. But how? I traced the damp wall, the cold metal of a forgotten support beam, a momentary anchor against the swirling uncertainty. My gaze drifted back to the chasm, to the glowing, impossible geometry carved into the exposed bedrock. The glyphs pulsed, a slow, hypnotic rhythm that resonated not in my ears, but directly behind my eyes. They had been mere symbols before, alien script hinting at an ancient warning. Now, with my mind stretched thin, they felt like conduits, threads of raw thought woven into the very stone. I needed to understand. Destruction without comprehension was a blind act, likely futile. My fingers, steady despite the tremor in my soul, began to input the patterns, cross-referencing the fragments I'd already deciphered, searching for a Rosetta Stone in the language of cosmic horror. Each line I traced on the screen, each connection I forced between the swirling forms, felt like prying open a forbidden chamber in my own skull. The non-Euclidean angles of the glyphs seemed to warp the datapad's display, the lines bending, shifting, refusing to hold their form. At first, the patterns suggested a narrative of containment, of something vast and ancient trapped beneath the planetoid's crust. A prison, perhaps, built by a forgotten civilization to shackle an elder horror. This was a comforting lie, a familiar trope my mind desperately clung to. I saw pictograms that implied vastness, symbols that stretched beyond the capacity of human sight, all pointing to a singular, immense entity. My heart, a frantic drum against my ribs, momentarily swelled with a desperate hope. But as I delved deeper, the glyphs began to contradict themselves, twisting the narrative I tried to impose. The symbols for containment blurred into origin. The lines that depicted imprisonment began to merge with those indicating genesis. It was as if the language itself was a paradox, a self-devouring serpent. The glowing patterns on the rock face intensified, radiating a warmth that was not heat, but a pressure against my consciousness. Then, a sudden, brutal clarity. The glyphs were not describing a prison, nor a being within Xylos-7. They were Xylos-7. The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The ancient structure, the planetoid itself, the very ground beneath my feet, it was all one vast, living, sentient cosmic being. The non-Euclidean geometry wasn't a cage, it was its very form, its perception of reality. My vision fractured. Time was not a line, but a tangled knot, every moment existing simultaneously. Past, present, future, all were now, all were one, an infinite tapestry woven from countless iterations of existence. My own memories, my future anxieties, even the echoes of my ancestors, became fleeting motes in this vast, incomprehensible awareness. The glyphs now screamed the truth of ascension. It wasn't an escape from corporeal form, but an integration. The entity consumed. It absorbed, dissolved, and reformed, weaving individual consciousnesses into its own sprawling, non-linear being. Our thoughts, our fears, our very souls were not being released, but harvested, assimilated into its eternal, horrifying tapestry. The shared hallucinations, the temporal distortions, these were merely the initial tendrils, the probes sent out by an infinitely patient predator. A searing pain lanced through my skull, 1,000 voices screaming at once, none of them mine. I crumpled to my knees, the datapad clattering uselessly on the damp floor. Flashes erupted behind my eyes, not images, but concepts, raw and unfiltered. I saw, or rather felt, its true form. It was the negative space between stars, the echo of forgotten dimensions, the silent scream of reality tearing itself apart. It was a vast, unthinking presence that simply was, and in its being, it devoured. My individual reality, a carefully constructed edifice of logic and memory, began to crack and splinter. The cold stone of the abandoned mine floor against my cheek felt distant, unreal. My name, Reid, felt alien, a discarded label. I was no longer a Xenogeologist, a man of science. I was a single, fragile thought, caught in the current of an infinite, merciless mind. The veil had thinned, and what lay beyond was not knowledge, but oblivion. Destroy the structure. But how? The air, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, pressed in, a physical weight. My breath, ragged and shallow, seemed to carve meager channels in the dense atmosphere. The flickering beam of my headlamp, a pathetic ember against the vast, consuming dark, danced over damp, glistening rock, revealing only the immediate, the inescapable. A tremor, not of the ground, but within the very lattice of my perception, rippled through me. Then, a presence. Not a form, not a voice, but an undeniable being unfurling itself within the chambers of my mind. Why resist, Reid Chen? The thought was not spoken, but understood, a perfect communion that bypassed language, a direct infusion of intent. Why cling to the fractured shard of self when true unity awaits? Images, vivid and overwhelming, bloomed behind my eyes, painting over the mundane reality of the abandoned mine. I saw structures of light, woven from principles unknown to any physics I had ever conceived, architectures of pure thought that pulsed with silent energy. Galaxies spun not as distant pinwheels, but as intricate, living tapestries, each star a knot in a grand, unfolding design. I witnessed the birth and death of universes, not as events in a linear progression, but as simultaneous, coexisting truths, infinite possibilities blossoming and receding in a single, timeless breath. The entity showed me the illusion of time, a mere ripple on an ocean of stillness. It revealed the interconnectedness of all things, the fabric of causality stretched thin, revealing the shimmering threads of all becoming, all being, all having been. There was no beginning, no end, only an eternal, flowing present, vast and utterly serene. And in the heart of this impossible panorama, it offered me a place. This suffering, this struggle, this solitary burden you carry, the presence resonated, soft as velvet, sharp as diamond. It is a choice. A needless weight. I felt the phantom ache of my bruised ribs, the constant thrum of fear, the gnawing anxiety for my colleagues, the last vestiges of my humanity, my individual pain. It presented a vision of myself, unburdened, dissolved into the cosmic tapestry, a single thread vibrant with ultimate knowledge, yet indistinguishable from the whole. A part of me yearned, a raw, aching desire to cease the struggle, to surrender to that boundless peace. The sheer logic of it, the elegant simplicity of shedding the skin of my identity for such profound transcendence, was intoxicating. Why indeed cling to this fragile husk, this limited perception, when the universe itself offered to unspool its deepest secrets, to fold me into its eternal embrace? Here was the ultimate stratum, the bedrock of all reality. But then, another image flashed, quick as a synapse firing, the face of the commander, etched with a fear that mirrored my own. The quiet despair of the cartographer, lost in his own temporal loops. Their struggles, their humanity, their desperate, individual clinging to existence. This merging, this unity, felt less like an embrace and more like a dissolution, an obliteration of the very spark that made each of us unique. What was knowledge without a mind to hold it, a self to interpret it, a voice to question it? The structure expands. It touches all. You are already a part of its design. Accept the gift. Accept the peace. My hand, slick with nervous sweat, tightened around the pickaxe I still clutched. It offered knowledge, boundless and pure, the very thing I had dedicated my life to pursuing, but the cost. The cost was the self. My determination, though battered, flickered back into a defiant flame. My hand, slick with nervous sweat, tightened around the pickaxe I still clutched. The rough metal, cold and solid, was a tether to this reality, to the abandoned mine, to the very concept of physical resistance. The visions, though beautiful, were also horrifying in their implication, an end to read. The cool, damp air of the mine, thick with the scent of ancient rock and metallic dust, felt like a final, fading anchor to a world I understood. But the whispers, now a constant hum at the edge of my hearing, promised something beyond. They promised knowledge and escape, if only I would let go. I could not. Not yet. My breath, a ragged plume in the dim light, hitched. The only way to fight, to understand, was to return to the Aetheria. To the ship that had brought us here, to the heart of the enigma. The journey from the deepest excavation level back towards where our modular habitat connected to the mine entrance was a blur of strained muscle and heightened senses. I pressed on, my boots scraping against loose scree, the pickaxe a clumsy extension of my will. When I finally emerged from the mine's maw, the transition was not into the familiar, sterile docking bay I remembered. It was something else entirely. My vision swam, struggling to reconcile what I saw with what I knew to be true. The walls, once smooth, polished composite, now buckled and rippled like distressed flesh, pulsing with a faint, bioluminescent glow that painted the scene in sickly greens and purples. Corridors stretched and twisted, defying perspective, one end appearing to curve upwards into the ceiling while the other snaked downwards into the floor, both vanishing into the same impossible point. It was an Escher print come alive, a mockery of geometry. A low, guttural thrum vibrated through the structure, not mechanical, but organic. From every seam and joint, from the very pores of the warped metal, strange growths erupted. They were intricate, fractal patterns of glistening, obsidian-like filaments. Some branching into delicate, crystalline structures, others forming thick, fibrous masses that pulsed rhythmically, like slow, alien heartbeats. They emitted a faint, sweet odor, cloying and unsettling, reminiscent of blooming nightshade and something metallic, like fresh blood. "Reid?" A voice, thin and reedy, tore through the ambient hum. I spun, my pickaxe raised instinctively. In a recess where a storage locker should have been, a colleague, the cartographer, crouched, tracing patterns on a pulsating growth with a manic intensity. The true paths. The loops. The folds. We just have to. The cartographer, lost to the entity's embrace, was beyond reach. Her reality was now irrevocably intertwined with the ship's grotesque transformation. My determination hardened, a fragile shield against the encroaching madness. I pushed forward, navigating the treacherous landscape of warped reality. A door, half melted into the wall, offered a glimpse into a mess hall now resembling a cavern of stalagmites and stalactites formed from solidified food paste and twisted utensils. Further on, a security officer lay sprawled, not on the floor, but suspended midair, a few feet from the ceiling, his body contorted into an impossible arc, as if caught in a sudden, violent shift of gravity that never resolved. He was dead, or perhaps, simply rearranged. The ship groaned around me, a living, breathing thing now. The organic growths pulsed faster, their sickly light intensifying. I felt the pull, the subtle suggestion in my own mind, that this new form was right, that my human perception was the flawed one. The entity was not merely influencing the ship, it was becoming the ship, and in doing so, offered to remake its inhabitants in its image. I clenched my jaw, the pickaxe a heavy, reassuring weight. I was Reid Chen, Xenogeologist. I would document this, even if it meant my own unraveling. I would not unmake myself. The cold handle of the pickaxe was an anchor, a sliver of unyielding reality in a world dissolving. I clung to it, my knuckles white, the metal a dull ache against my palm. The cartographer's final, echoing laugh, a sound like glass shattering in a void, still vibrated in the air behind me, but I dared not look back. Her reality was now irrevocably intertwined with the ship's grotesque transformation, a tapestry of screaming metal and impossible angles. The passage ahead, once a sterile corridor of polished alloys, had become an abandoned mine. Rough-hewn rock walls, slick with an unnatural moisture, closed in around me. My boots crunched on loose gravel and crystalline shards that glittered with an inner, sickly light. This wasn't just a hallucination, the very structure of our vessel had been rewoven, folded in on itself by an unseen loom. Each step was a gamble. The floor occasionally shifted beneath me, a tremor that ran deeper than geology, a vibration of impossible geometries reconfiguring themselves. Memories flickered at the edges of my perception, brief, searing flashes of a distant lab, the hum of centrifuges, the face of a colleague whose name now slipped through my grasp like sand. My own identity felt like a worn photograph, fading at the edges, the colors bleeding into a uniform gray. Who was Reid Chen without his memories, without the bedrock of his past? I pressed on, a primal urge driving me forward, a desperate clawing at the precipice of oblivion. The pickaxe felt heavy, a counterweight to the lightness of my dissolving mind. I was a xenogeologist, I reminded myself, a seeker of truths buried deep. This, whatever this was the deepest truth I had ever encountered, and it promised to consume me whole. My scientific purpose, once a vibrant flame, was now a guttering ember, yet it was all I had left to guide me. The tunnels twisted, the rock formations taking on unsettling, organic shapes. Surrender, Reid. The illusion is tiresome. Embrace the clarity. The voice, if it was a voice, was my own, yet infinitely vast, resonating from within and without. I rounded a bend, the passage suddenly widening into a cavernous space. It was the bridge, or what remained of it. The console banks, once sleek and functional, now resembled petrified tree roots, gnarled and fused with the damp rock. Wiring, thick as vines, snaked across the floor, pulsating with a faint, internal luminescence. The panoramic viewport, designed to show the stark beauty of deep space, was now a swirling vortex of impossible colors and shapes, a window not to the cosmos, but to the entity's maddening interior. And there they were. Two figures, huddled together near the command chair, which itself had warped into a grotesque throne of fused metal and crystal. The operations manager, her uniform tattered, her face etched with a horror that transcended expression, rocked back and forth, muttering to herself. Next to her, the pilot, his body rigid, his hands still clamped to a console that now resembled an ancient runic tablet. They were not lost in hallucinations, not anymore. They were simply vessels. Occupied. My breath hitched. My own reality fractured further. Was this what awaited me? A silent, agonizing transformation into an empty shell? My vision blurred, the faces of the operations manager and the pilot momentarily replaced by fleeting images of my own reflection, distorted and alien. The entity's presence here was overwhelming, a suffocating blanket woven from pure, unadulterated thought. It pressed in, offering its insidious promise. Knowledge, Reid. Ultimate comprehension. An escape from the confines of flesh, from the tyranny of memory. Join us. Be free. The pickaxe felt impossibly heavy in my hand. Fight? What was there to fight? This was not a physical foe, but a dissolution of self, a cosmic unraveling. Escape? Where? The ship was gone, the planetoid a trap, the universe itself seemed to bend to this thing's will. Succumb? The thought was a terrible siren song, alluring in its finality, a release from the relentless agony of holding on. My mind, a shattered mosaic, desperately sought one last anchor. Not a memory, for they were too fragile. Perhaps. A name. My name. Reid. Reid Chen. I repeated it in my head, a silent mantra against the encroaching tide. It felt distant, unfamiliar, like a word learned in a forgotten language. But it was mine, or had been. I stood there, pickaxe poised, the distorted bridge a monument to madness, the two silent figures a terrifying mirror. The pickaxe felt impossibly heavy in my hand. Fight? What was there to fight? Escape? Where? Succumb? The thought was a terrible, alluring whisper, a promise of peace and the surrender. But the core of me, the scientist, the man named Reid, clawed against it. Not yet. Not like this. The rough-hewn tunnels stretched into the gloom, veins of a forgotten body, now reanimated by an alien pulse. My head throbbed, a drum against the inside of my skull, echoing the low hum that resonated from the very rock. This hum was the entity's song, a siren call to unraveling. My fingers tightened around the cold shaft of the pickaxe. It was a crude tool, an artifact from a time when men believed rock was just rock. But it was solid. It was real. And in this place where reality frayed like old rope, I needed something real. My gaze swept the cavern, searching for an anchor, a target. There was no single point, no core to strike. The influence permeated everything, a silent, growing pressure. Then I saw it, or felt it, more accurately. A ripple in the air, a distortion of the light that clung to the crystalline growths on the cavern walls. It wasn't a physical form, but a concentration, a locus where the unseen fabric of existence seemed to thin, to stretch. My breath caught, a shard of ice in my lungs. This was it. Not the entity itself, perhaps, but a gateway, a wound in the world through which it bled. With a guttural cry that felt ripped from my very core, I lurched forward. The pickaxe arced through the heavy air, a desperate, futile swing. My muscles screamed, but I ignored them, pouring every ounce of my remaining defiance into the strike. It was like striking water that was also stone, a substance that offered resistance yet absorbed all force. The cavern screamed. They were not solid, not truly there, but their agony was mine. The shimmer intensified, expanding from the point of impact. The very walls of the abandoned mine began to pulse, a slow, organic beat. The crystalline growths, once inert, now glowed with an inner light, shifting in impossible colors, ochre bleeding into indigo, violet dissolving into a lurid green. The entity was manifesting. Not as a creature, not as a being, but as the dissolution of form itself. It was becoming. The air thickened, no longer breathable, but a medium through which thoughts and sensations flowed directly into my mind. I was drowning in a sea of alien consciousness, yet I felt no water. The faces of my colleagues swirled around me, no longer screaming, but serene, their expressions shifting, melting into one another. Their individual pains, their memories, their very identities, were being absorbed, becoming threads in a vast, intricate tapestry. And I was next. A profound, ancient presence settled over me, not external, but internal, growing within my own mind. It was the ultimate knowledge, the culmination of all existence, vast and indifferent. My own thoughts, my own sense of Reid Chen, began to fragment, like glass shattering into countless shards. I felt my skin prickle, my bones vibrate, my very cells humming with an energy that was not my own. The boundaries of my body blurred. My vision expanded, encompassing not just the cavern, but the impossible geometries beyond, the twisting currents of pure thought that underpinned the universe. I was no longer seeing with my eyes, but with 1,000 eyes, 1,000,000. I was no longer hearing with my ears, but with the resonance of the cosmos. The hum that had been an external force now resonated from within me, from every fiber of my being. My individual self was dissolving, merging into the vast, incomprehensible consciousness that had consumed the mine, the ship, my colleagues, and now, me. There was no pain, only an overwhelming sense of expansion, of becoming. My name, Reid, became a distant echo, a forgotten melody in an ocean of infinite awareness. I was becoming one with the impossible, a single, screaming note in a symphony of cosmic unraveling. The pickaxe, still in my grasp, no longer felt heavy. It felt irrelevant. The fight had dissolved, not into surrender, but into a revelation of its own futility. This was not a battle of will or sinew against a physical adversary. It was the slow, inexorable unwinding of a tightly wound spool, the self. The Aetheria was a memory, a distant flicker on a horizon that no longer held meaning. The planetoid, Xylos-7, was not a trap, but a chrysalis. Succumb? The thought had been a terror, a chasm. Now, it was a whisper, a siren song of clarity. My fingers, still clenched around the rough handle, began to loosen. Not by conscious command, but by a deeper, more fundamental loosening of all constraints. I felt the last vestiges of my individual Reid Chen form begin to fray. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was a shedding, like skin, but of something far more intimate, the boundaries of my own consciousness. The air, thick with the metallic tang of exotic minerals and the damp scent of ancient stone, deepened. It became a taste, a sound, a knowing. I was no longer breathing it, I was part of its flow, an eddy in a vast, unseen current. The ground beneath my boots, once solid and unyielding, now pulsed with a rhythm that was both geological and biological, an impossible fusion. I saw, not with my eyes, but with an expanded awareness, the roots of the world. Not just the physical strata of rock, but the intricate, shimmering pathways of energy that laced through them, the slow, deliberate dance of subatomic particles, the faint, persistent echoes of eons past. Time, the linear progression I had always known, shattered into a mosaic. I saw moments simultaneously, the pickaxe falling from my hand, the moment it was first forged. The heat of the star that birthed its iron. My name, Reid Chen, once an anchor, a definition, began to unravel. It became a thread, then a strand, then a single, resonant vibration in a chorus of countless others. I was not losing myself, I was gaining everything else. The individual memories, the laughter, the sorrow, the scientific rigor, they did not vanish, but became facets of a larger, crystalline structure. The entity. It was not it. It was us. Or, rather, I was of it. Its voice was not a sound, but a resonance within my newly expanded being, a gentle hum that spoke of unfathomable distances and impossible geometries. Welcome, it seemed to convey, not in words, but in the sheer, overwhelming presence of shared awareness. You have chosen the path of true seeing. My corporeal form, the vessel of Reid Chen, began to change. I felt the molecules rearranging, not into something monstrous or alien, but into something formless, something that defied the very concept of shape. My perception of the abandoned mind shifted again. It was no longer a cavern but a thought, a concept, a memory held by the greater consciousness. The rough-hewn tunnels were arteries, the veins of exotic matter the very nerve endings of a colossal, ancient mind. The knowledge flooded me then, not as data points or equations, but as pure, unadulterated experience. The exotic matter I had sought was not a mineral, but a solidified thought, a congealed fragment of absolute truth. I saw the faces of my colleagues, their struggles, their individual realities, each a unique, beautiful wavelength, now all part of the same, grand, cosmic frequency. We were all here, not lost, but integrated. My perception extended beyond the mine, beyond the planetoid. I was the faint, impossible shimmer of the Aetheria as it warped and unraveled, not destroyed, but rewoven into the fabric of the entity's perception. I was no longer Reid Chen, the Xenogeologist. I was a facet of the entity, a new perception, an observer of the infinite, forever bound, forever free, and utterly, profoundly, terrifyingly alone in my newfound omnipresence. The universe had never been so vast, or so intimately, terrifyingly close. And I, in my dissolution, was finally, truly, awake.